Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Eric Shupin. I'm the Director of Public Policy here at CHAPA. Thank you for joining us for our first COVID CHAPA affordable housing call really in the last month. We took a break for a few weeks, but we're back and certainly have plenty to provide updates on. I hope that everyone in the meantime has stayed healthy and safe. But today we have a wide range of issues to cover, but for just housekeeping, please, as a reminder, keep yourself muted. We will also have the ability to mute you if you don't mute yourself. So if you find yourself muted, that may be one of us having done that for you. There's a chat feature where you can submit questions as you have them, as we have people covering different topics. Or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask that question when the time comes. We have many different things to cover this afternoon, but on the agenda for today, I'll just go over quickly. We're going to hear from Annette Duke from the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute, MLRI, on the Right to Counsel Pilot Program for COVID-19. Then we'll hear federal updates from Ryan Dominguez at CHAPA. We'll hear from Carol Marine at CHAPA on the eviction moratorium challenge that is pending in court right now. I will then cover state budget and legislative updates. And my colleague Dana will then cover an updates on regional meetings that CHAPA has been hosting, as well as the emergency rental assistance, the local emergency rental assistance report that we're working on with Mass Housing Partnership and DHCD. And then finally, Abi Kerve, also from CHAPA, will share very quickly on some new data and reports that have been put out, some as recently as today. And so with that, I want to jump right in. Annette, I think you may have joined us. So if you'll unmute yourself, you can talk about the Right to Counsel pilot program that we've been working on.
Thanks, Eric. Good to see everyone. Hope everyone is staying well. So the right to counsel, several bills were filed at the beginning of last year. We had a great hearing. The coalition has grown to over 130 organizations that would support a right to counsel for low-income tenants. And then COVID hit in March, and our Right to Counsel Advisory Committee went back into the room and started thinking about how to respond to the tsunami of evictions that people are beginning to read about in the paper. The estimates are from landlord organizations or from the housing court that 15 to 20,000 evictions could hit the housing court when the moratorium lifts. So everyone is bracing ourselves for that. So the Right to Counsel Coalition Advisory Committee put together a pilot program, really at the request of Senator Sal DiDomingo. We submitted it to him and he filed it. It's all happening very quickly. The bill would provide a right to counsel pilot program statewide. What it would do is it would, again, provide full representation for low-income tenants and for owner-occupants who are actually evicting tenants, whose home may be at stake too, just like the Volunteer Lawyers Project currently does in Boston. The pilots would be based statewide. Our hope is that there would be 2 pilots in each of the housing court's 6 divisions. The housing court has 6 divisions that covers the whole state. And that it would be based, where they would cite it would be based on how COVID has impacted communities hardest, those hardest hit by COVID. The cost of a pilot, we estimate, would be $6 million to cover about 5,000 cases. Today, just actually moments ago, we sent the governor a letter urging him to use the coronavirus relief funds, 6 million of those, to fund the pilot. It turns out, and many thanks to Ryan and Eric for helping us with this, and especially Ryan for help with the math on this. But it turns out that $6 million is about 0.003% of what is currently remaining in coronavirus relief funds. Obviously, the need is urgent. Other states around the country are starting to use their, or have used some of their coronavirus relief funds for rental assistance and for eviction prevention programs. So we feel that they can be used. And we hope that the Housing Committee, where the bill has been reported, will hear this quickly. We think that they probably won't have a hearing, but they will submit, we can all submit written testimony. I know many of you have joined the coalition already. If you haven't, I would urge that you do, and I can put a link in the chat box on how to do that. And the other thing that's happened, many reports have been issued in the last 2 weeks. The Boston Bar Association issued a report about the cost benefits, the cost savings to a right to counsel, documenting that for every dollar that the state would invest, it would save $2.40 in healthcare costs and in other costs. And also had a lot of data about who is facing homelessness and who is affected by evictions. There was also another report that was issued by MIT with City Life showing that in Boston, evictions hit communities of color hardest. So there's a lot happening right now with evictions. This is one part. We feel that right to counsel is one part of a comprehensive strategy that includes other strategies that many of you in CHAPA are working on. But we're working to get a lawyer in people's corner when they have to face an eviction. So Eric, you think, and also let me just say again, many thanks to Eric and Ryan for their help. They've both been part of the advisory committee, and it's really been great to have CHAPA be part of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Annette. I appreciate that
So
update.
can I have one question?
Yes,
Sure.
please.
Okay, thank you very much for that's very good idea. So I'm a small landlord. So for, as you mentioned, I'm already make the eviction, but for the coronavirus, I cannot eviction. But now it's like almost 5 months past. It's hard. So I appreciate you get a lot of funding. I will see if the funding can go Boston Housing Court. And then if we'll check how much rent the tenant owned, and then court directly go to the landlord. So landlord's, okay, you stay, I won't evict you. Do you think that is a more directly way shortcut? And then so in that case, reduce the homeless people, reduce the eviction. And then so now the money goes to organization, you apply, sometimes the tenant, they do not know how to apply. They are lazy. They just say, okay, we just do this. So I will see if the government's money go to the court, and the court, after court, go to the landlord. So, and then both are happy.
So I appreciate the struggles that small property owners have during this time. Two things. One, as I said, we feel like right to counsel is part of a larger comprehensive strategy that does include rental assistance funds. It's part of it. Rental assistance funds are not going to solve everything, and there's still going to be people who are going to face eviction and who need a lawyer. They needed a lawyer before COVID, and they need a lawyer now even more. But we do see this as part of a larger strategy to provide rental assistance, and many others are working on that. The other thing I just want to be clear about is that the right to counsel would be that low-income owner-occupants would be eligible for counsel if they're evicting someone, if their housing is at stake. And so, for example, if you live in the property and there's a tenant that you're evicting and you are income eligible, you would be entitled to counsel. So that's two responses to that. Are there other questions that people have?
Yes, we have time for one more question, and this is in the chat box. And Denise asked, the pilot program proposes an attorney at housing courts. Is there any plan for those summary process cases being heard in district court?
Hey, Denise, good question. Unfortunately, we narrowed it for the pilot. For purposes of the pilot, it would be in housing court. We can't do it all. Even in the bill that we filed originally, where we wanted to do it all, it would be phased in. And there's a lot of challenges, in terms of how to scale this up. So at this point, the pilot is just in housing court. We know that Quincy has a very heavy caseload. We're aware of that.
Thank you. And thank you again, Annette, for sharing that information and for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to include the link. I included a link to the bill, and this is a link to the website of the Massachusetts Right to Counsel Coalition. So I hope you check that website out and to learn about the bill as well as how to support it. So thank you again. So with that, I'm going to turn things over now to my colleague, Ryan, to provide us updates on what's happening with federal resources and legislation. So Ryan?
Thanks, Eric. So for the federal side, when we last spoke, the HEROES Act had just been passed by the House. And since that time, there has not been really any movement on HEROES, as the Senate Republicans have not come to the table for negotiations. And they really don't have any kind of urgency to right now. And with kind of the timing issues that we're coming up against, so July 4th holiday, they'll have 2 weeks vacation, which will bring them to kind of the middle of July. And when they come back, they'll be still debating kind of a police reform bill, which is much needed, but they'll also be focused on an FY21 budget markup for the next budget cycle. So we're really looking at, end of July at the earliest for any type of HEROES Act negotiations. So now Democrats in both the House and the Senate have taken up a different strategy as they have started to file bills that include housing provisions of the HEROES Act as kind of separate legislation. And to highlight just a few, the House passed the Emergency Housing Protections and Relief Act of 2020, which includes all of the housing investments from the HEROES Act, including the $100 billion for rental assistance, an extended eviction moratorium for 1 year, as well as a $75 billion homeowner assistance fund. So it's great to have that kind of as a separate HEROES Act, just housing provisions legislation. And then outside of that, the Senate has filed separate provisions of just the HEROES Act as single legislation. For example, Senator Warren filed the Protecting Renters from Evictions and Fees Act, which extends the federal eviction moratorium for 1 year and prohibits late fees. And then Senator Brown filed the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act, which includes the $100 billion for rental assistance. So there's a few different approaches going on. One is to include all of the housing protections into one bill, as well as kind of separating them out into single legislation, so that if we do come to a point where we can discuss specific housing investments to go into a next stimulus package, then we can potentially get one or two things or the whole package into one kind of bill. There was also a couple infrastructure bills that included housing investments. The first is the Moving Forward Act, which the House should be voting on either today or tomorrow. And this was a expansive kind of $1.5 trillion infrastructure package that included all of our LIHTC asks, including the 4% minimum, as well as $100 billion for constructing and preserving affordable housing. Senate Democrats filed their version, which is known as the Emergency Affordable Housing Act of 2020, and it was nearly identical to the Moving Forward Act and includes many of the same provisions. We've been pushing for housing as infrastructure, so this is really great to see. But at the same time, just like the HEROES Act, I think it's really up to the Senate Republicans to respond and pick up this legislation, and they're unlikely to pick it up anytime soon, especially with the HEROES Act also on their desk. So with that said, we'll continue to push for anything we can get at this point, whether through HEROES or through separate legislation that has been filed. And we'll try to keep you updated as things progress down in DC. But I think that all of this kind of underscores the importance of focusing our attention on ensuring that the funds that we do have from the CARES Act are allocated properly. Since we last spoke, there has also been additional rounds of CDBG and ESG funding that has been issued. Massachusetts received an extra $26 million in CDBG and an extra $27 million in ESG. At CHAPA, we've been advocating through letters and through calls with the administration around priorities we'd like to see for CDBG and ESG. And it's really good to see those dollars go towards things like the new Emergency Rental and Mortgage Assistance Program, or IRMA. And I think some of my colleagues will touch on this a little bit later. So there's still a little bit of CDBG and ESG money left from the CARES Act, but that funding is really going to be based on need, and we're going to have to really be compared to other states and what their COVID-19 transmission is like, and what their housing kind of disruptions are at that time. There's also been a little bit more clarity, like Annette had mentioned earlier, around the Coronavirus Relief Fund. For those of you who are not familiar, this is kind of the largest sum of money that the state has received. And out of the around $2.5 billion that the state has under its control, around $502 million is directly earmarked towards cities and towns across the Commonwealth. And this funding will actually go out in 2 rounds, one now and one later in the fall. So it's really important that we continue to advocate for things like right to counsel, as MLRI has demonstrated, as well as additional funding for rental assistance and senior housing. And we'll continue doing this through our advocacy at CHAPA. Finally, there's been a number of regulatory waivers that have been issued from HUD for all of the different federal housing programs that were funded through the CARES Act, including HOME, CDBG, and ESG. And HUD actually compiled a list of kind of a mega waiver guidance document, and I'll add that to the chat box now so you all can know how these funds can be used flexibly in each of your communities, and can try to push your local municipalities to put some of this funding towards housing and homelessness. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for those updates. A question that Josephine had asked us, if you could share Senator Warren's bill number, that would be appreciated. Maybe if you can follow up in the chat with information on that legislation.
Yeah, I'll post the bill text and all the information into the chat box as well.
Thank you. And there's a question from Jeffrey Alkins. He asks about the coronavirus raft annual amount being in whether that amount has been increased above the $4,000 allotment. I will cover that in just a few minutes because I'm going to talk about the emergency rental assistance programs that have been both proposed as well as new exciting updates from DHCD and the Baker administration on funding that they're making available for emergency rental assistance. So I'll get to that in just a few minutes. Jeff, if you can just hold on. And are there any other questions for Ryan? If not, again, Ryan, thank you. We appreciate you sharing all of that information. And with that, there's some information being posted in the chat box, so thank you for sharing that. But now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Carol Marine, to provide updates on the court challenge to the eviction moratorium. Carol?
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. I'll give an overview of the case, Maturin v. Commonwealth, and then discuss CHAPA's plan to file an amicus brief on housing as critical healthcare policy. In late May, 2 Massachusetts landlords, one with property in Worcester and one with property in Allston, filed a lawsuit challenging the emergency eviction moratorium legislation, H4647, entitled An Act Providing for a Moratorium on Evictions and Foreclosures During the COVID-19 Emergency. The legislation signed by Governor Baker was designed to address the public health crisis by ensuring that people stay at home and practice social distancing to prevent the spread of the virus. In Maturin v. Commonwealth, the plaintiffs sought emergency relief, filing directly with the Supreme Judicial Court, claiming the moratorium infringes on their Massachusetts and U.S. constitutional rights to access state courts and enforce their contracts. They claim that the law amounts to a partial seizure of real estate and that they have no other way to recoup financial losses. It is a procedurally complicated case, and the named defendants in the suit include the Commonwealth, the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development, and the Chief Justices of each of the Housing Court, the District Court, and the Superior Court. Plaintiffs are also suing to block the regulations promulgated by EOHED, which is why they're named. The Attorney General is responding on behalf of all the defendants. The moratorium halts most non-essential residential and small business evictions so long as the state of emergency remains in effect. Non-essential evictions do not include any that involve allegations of criminal activity or lease violations that may impact public safety. The measure does not exempt tenants from the requirement of paying rent, but it does block landlords from imposing late fees or alerting a credit agency if a renter can prove a failure to pay stems from a COVID-related financial hardship. The moratorium remains in effect until August 18th, 2020, or 45 days after the COVID-19 emergency declaration has been lifted, whichever is earlier. And there is a provision for the governor to extend for 90-day periods. And I will post the summary of the law in the chat. On June 24th, Judge Lowy of the SJC declined to take up the case and sent it down to the Superior Court for a hearing on the merits, as well as a determination on whether 4 community organizations will be allowed to intervene. At the same time, he dismissed the case against each of the other courts, noting that if the law is found to be unconstitutional, he has no doubt that the justices will abide by the ruling. Then yesterday, petitioners filed a motion for preliminary injunction, and we're waiting to hear from the court what the timing of that hearing will be. As for CHAPA's role, CHAPA is submitting an amicus brief to lay out the critical role that housing and housing policy play in both household and community health. A safe, healthy, and affordable place to call home is where healthcare starts, and that has been true long before the pandemic. But the pandemic has shed a stark light on that nexus, and we will be highlighting the importance of housing as healthcare now, but also in non-pandemic times. We'd like to use the opportunity to make the connection between housing as the center of health policy, focusing on how healthy, safe, and affordable housing impacts the health of children and families in a really transformative way, and uplifts communities, particularly those that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. So that's where we are as of about noon today, and stay tuned. And I will post the summary of the moratorium legislation in the chat.
Thank you so much, Carol. Are there any questions that people might have? And Andrea Park from MLRI says that there's still no word from the Superior Court yet. So thank you for sharing.
Thanks,
that.
Andrea.
So I just curiously, so all the information and the link you will post on, give us by email, right? So before I remember after that, and the people make the summary for the meeting and send us, is the same as today?
The summary I posted is the summary of the provisions of the legislation that's in force now.
Yes, but it doesn't mean for the meeting, for all the related information, finally will send us by email. Is that true?
Yes, we will post notes for this meeting shortly after. In a few days, we'll gather all the links and information that's been posted, as well as provide a summary for what's been discussed. And we'll post that on our website. So in a few days, you can check and you can look on the COVID page on CHAPA's website and be able to download the notes, as well as access to all the links that were shared.
So Mami, can we get it by email?
We will post them. We haven't shared them by email, but again, if you just go to chapa.org and to our COVID page, it'll be posted right there. So you can check in a few days for that there.
Oh, okay, not by email.
We won't send out a separate email with the notes, no, but again, you can just go right to our CHAPA website. So with that, thank you, Carol. Unless there are any other questions, and I don't see any in the chat box, I'm going to go into the next portion where I'm going to provide updates on the state budget and legislative updates. Certainly plenty going on as we enter the new fiscal year, as well as come to the end of our legislative session in Massachusetts. But we have some really exciting news to announce and to share, not to announce, but yesterday, the Baker-Polito administration announced that they're making $20 million available for an emergency rental and mortgage assistance program, IRMA. This $20 million will provide direct funding to eligible households who have suffered financial hardships during the COVID emergency, and it will help pay for rent or mortgage assistance to low-income households with incomes between 50% of the area median income and 80% of the area median income. IRMA will provide up to $4,000 for eligible households for arrears going back to payments due April 1st, 2020. Beginning today, people can apply by reaching out to the 11 regional administering agencies who already offer RAFT on the state's behalf. And that includes all the HCECs, the Housing Consumer Education Centers, as well as Elhand and Lind and the Central Massachusetts Housing Alliance, CMHA. Funding for this program comes from $10 million from the CDBG CARES Act funding, as well as $5 million from tenant-based rental assistance funding and $5 million from moving to work flexibilities funding. The new program will serve twice as many households as the traditional RAFT program by expanding eligibility to families who would not otherwise qualify for RAFT. So RAFT, the program that currently exists, serve households at 50% or below of the area median income, and those households can currently access that program to help with past rent or mortgage payments. The program, the IRMA, Emergency Rental and Mortgage Assistance Program, will target that 50% to 80%. So making sure that low-income households from 0% of the area median income all the way up to 80% of the area median income have access to rental assistance. So I wanted to thank the Baker administration as well as DHCD. I know we have folks from DHCD, including Amy Mullen, I believe is joining us, who helped to put together and implement this program. And thanks also to all the HCECs and regional administering agencies who will be offering this resource to households around Massachusetts. There's a question, will IRMA be available to residents of entitlement communities? I'm going to answer, and of course, but we'll defer if Amy wants to jump in from DHCD to correct me, but this is a question that I posed to DHCD, and they said that yes, IRMA will be available to residents of entitlement communities. And this has to do with there's funding that has come in for CDBG. There's money that goes to DHCD, to Massachusetts, and there are dollars that go to entitlement communities. In some cases, the money that goes to the state can't then be used in entitlement communities. However, under the CARES Act and the second round of CDBG funding, the IRMA dollars are allowed to be used in those entitlement communities. Amy, did I get that right, or Kristen?
Yep, that's right. Thanks.
Thank you. And that should also answer, I know there was a question earlier from Jeffrey about the amount of RAFT. The benefit amount for RAFT as well as for IRMA is currently still at the $4,000 cap. For IRMA, that's what the amount is. I am going to talk about in a minute a supplemental budget that is pending before the legislature that may provide for a higher cap, but I'll get to that in just a minute. So there's a question from MJ. The new 2020 HUD income guidelines became effective today and are in our lower than the 2019 guidelines. Do we use the new income numbers? That's something that I would pose to either Amy or Kristen to see if they might be able to answer.
Hi, this is Amy. Yep, we're using the fiscal year 2020 AMI for both IRMA and for RAFT.
Thank you, Amy. There's another question. Can my client get these funds to bring the loan current rather than the current forbearance that automatically extends the term? I can't answer that as of right now. Again, I look to Amy if she might be able to answer, and if not, we can find out and report back to you, Donna. And there's a comment logistically, will IRMA applications be processed in the same way as RAFT? Trying to understand the administration as opposed to or in concert with RAFT. It's my understanding that there will be one application for these programs, so that when people go to apply for emergency rental assistance, whether it's the traditional RAFT funding or these new IRMA dollars, that's all going to be in one application. So with that, again, thank you to DHCD for working on this and for responding to the needs of low-income households. And we look forward to seeing how the funds and resources are used. So with that, I'm going to provide an update on the state budget. We have just entered the next fiscal year. As of today, July 1 is the first day of the next fiscal year. Currently, there is no, so we're in FY fiscal year 2021. Currently, there is no full FY21 budget for the state. The legislature is still waiting to see what the revenue outlook is for Massachusetts before passing a full FY 2021 budget. I think it should be no surprise that revenue numbers are down by several $billions. And so the fiscal outlook is not great when it comes to looking at what funding the state might have available. They're waiting after the COVID crisis happened, the tax filing deadline was extended. And so they're waiting for that new deadline to go through to see what the revenue picture is. In the meantime, we're operating under short-term budgets for FY21. Just last week, the legislature passed a short-term $5.25 billion budget to allow Massachusetts to continue operating for the month of July. And it's expected that there will be another short-term budget passed in August for the legislature to continue working on the full FY21 budget. In the meantime, the funding levels for programs like MRVP and other affordable housing, the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program, and other housing programs are expected to be based on last year's, so FY20's spending levels. So it's expected that most programs will be level funded during those short-term budgets before the final FY21 budget is passed. We'll be working to advocate for supporting all of our affordable housing, homelessness prevention, and community development resources in the full FY21 budget. And we'll certainly be sharing opportunities to help advocate for those resources as we get further into the summer and as the FY21 budget is being worked on. In the meantime, the legislature is currently working on a supplemental budget for FY20. So this is a budget in response to COVID that is providing funding for COVID response expenses. And the House passed a version of their supplemental budget, and the Senate is expected to pass their version of the supplemental budget on Thursday. The exciting news from the supplemental budget is that it includes millions of dollars for affordable housing, homelessness prevention, and community development programs. So we're hopeful and optimistic that when the Senate passes this on Thursday, the governor will then quickly sign it and these dollars can become available. Specifically, the supplemental budget would provide $20 million for residential assistance for families in transition, RAFT. This is the emergency rental assistance program that we've been talking about. The IRMA program would supplement that RAFT, but this would provide $20 million in state dollars for the RAFT program. And it would create a COVID-19 RAFT response program within RAFT. And that coronavirus response program would allow households to receive up to $10,000 in assistance. As I said earlier, the current cap is at $4,000. But this supplemental budget would allow up to $10,000 to be accessed by households to be able to pay housing expenses like rent arrears or mortgage payments. It would direct that 33% or a third of those funds would go towards extremely low-income households, and to make sure that those households, those extremely low-income households, are still being served by RAFT. We're excited that and appreciative that the legislature has listened to all of our voices as we advocated for these emergency rental assistance funds and responded. And again, we're optimistic that this will be passed by the Senate on Thursday and then hopefully signed by the governor as quickly as possible. The supplemental budget also includes $13.5 million for local housing authorities, over $2.5 million for family and individual shelters, an additional $1.5 million for housing consumer education centers, nearly $6 million to support permanent supportive housing, and $1 million for unaccompanied homeless youth. So this is all really encouraging to see in the supplemental budget. In terms of actions that we can take right now, it's just you can reach out to your state representative and state senator. To your representatives, you can say thank you for supporting that budget. To your state senator, if you contact them before today, to ask them to please support the supplemental budget when it comes up for a vote. Again, that's expected to happen tomorrow. And then, of course, to turn to the governor and ask him to quickly sign the supplemental budget so that these dollars can be made available and we can have those additional $20 million for RAFT. In addition to the state operating budget, I also wanted to provide an update on our capital budget. The Baker administration released about 2 weeks ago the FY21 capital budget. And the capital budget provides resources to help finance affordable housing in Massachusetts. These are the programs that were, the authorization was passed in 2018 with the $1.8 billion housing bond bill. And the capital budget is what the governor then allocates of that authorization for these affordable housing programs. The capital budget for FY21 was level funded from FY20. So it's expected that there will still be a strong pipeline of affordable housing resources available to help create and preserve affordable housing in Massachusetts in the coming year. And so we were encouraged to see that. We'll be able to post a link on the chat box with updates on the capital budget, and you can see the allocation for all of these programs. So I'm going to pause there. Those are the updates on the budget, and I wanted to pause to see if there are any questions before I move on to legislative updates. Let's see. So there is a question, would the FY20 sub-budget funds only be available for expenditures that were made during FY20 or limited to FY20? So this is from Laura. The supplemental budget, even though it was a supplemental budget to the FY20 budget, which ended yesterday, the funding would still be available through FY21, the next fiscal year. The legislation specifically allows for those dollars to remain available into FY21. And there should be a link to, in the chat box, just information on the supplemental budget. And you can get a link to the legislation and a summary on the legislation, which goes into more detail on how those funds, or what those funds are for and when they can be used by. And thank you, Abi, for posting those details and those links. So there was a question that I received that doesn't only allow some of the dollars to be available into FY21 and others to FY20. So there are two different trusts that are created by the supplemental budget, and these are two different reserves that the dollars are allocated through. It is, this question is from Caitlin. So it is correct that one of the funds can only be made available through FY20. It's my understanding that those are funds for expenses already incurred by housing, by shelters or housing authorities. This is where the $2.5 million for emergency family and individual shelters, as well as the $13.5 million for local housing authorities, are within that reserve that it would only be made available through FY20. However, those are for, again, expenses that have already been incurred, and the legislature has to pass this budget in order to then be reimbursed by the federal government for those expenses that have been incurred. So that's my understanding of how those reserves are working. I will, of course, share, as I learn more, I will share and provide updates on the website, but Again, that's my understanding. So turning now to legislative updates, I wanted to share an update on a new data reporting law that went into effect a few weeks ago. On June 7th, Governor Baker signed the COVID-19 data reporting law that allows for the collection and publication of certain COVID-19 data and creates a task force to understand the impact of the virus on underserved and underrepresented populations. CHAPA supports the important goals of the law to increase data collection to better protect and meet the needs of those who are most impacted. However, the new law does place new reporting requirements on all housing for seniors and persons with disabilities. Those reporting requirements include notifying each resident and each resident's healthcare proxy each time that there is a new COVID-19 case, death, or suspected cases among several staff members. And it also requires that housing providers for seniors and persons with disabilities to report daily to the local boards of health and the Department of Public Health of all known COVID-19 cases and deaths amongst residents and staff. The Department of Public Health is then required to publish that information on their website, again, to be updated daily. Again, while we agree with the need for information and transparent data sharing on COVID cases, this is a burdensome requirement for housing providers for seniors and persons with disabilities. The legislation places the reporting requirements on all elder care facilities, and those elder care facilities include nursing and skilled care facilities where medical treatment is provided regularly to residents and there's medical staff on site. That's different than what housing providers for seniors and persons with disabilities provide to their residents. The housing providers do not have access to the private health information of their residents, nor is there any duty of residents to disclose their private health information to their housing provider. So CHAPA is concerned about the burden that this places on housing providers, as well as the risk of tenant resident private health information being shared. It also will be burdensome for housing providers to comply with the law by making daily notifications to residents. And so we're supporting legislation that the governor filed in response to concerns that CHAPA raised, which is bill number S2753. And this was legislation that the governor filed as he signed the data reporting law, recognizing that housing providers for seniors and persons with disabilities shouldn't be subject to the same reporting requirement as skilled care facilities where medical care is being provided to residents. The legislation is currently before the Joint Committee on Public Health, and there's actually a hearing on that bill tomorrow. There will not be a virtual or in-person hearing. Instead, the committee will be accepting written testimony for the legislation through tomorrow. And there's a link that we'll share on how you can take action to help support the legislation S2753 and getting it passed so that housing providers for seniors and persons with disabilities are removed from the reporting requirements of the data reporting law. Again, it's, I ask that all of you to please go to the website. There's a link for how to submit testimony, which you can fill out your information, and the committee has actually set up a page to say, yes, to provide your information and say, yes, I support this. And also the opportunity to say why. So we encourage you to go to our website. There's an action alert, and you can use that information to help us pass S2753. And thank you, Abi, for sharing that link. I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions or comments on that. I see that Annette has said that Mass Union of Public Housing Tenants with MLRI will also be submitting testimony supporting the legislation. Thank you so much. I know we've also been working with our partners at Two Life Communities, as well as Mass Narrow and other affordable housing developers like POA. So I appreciate all of your support for that. In the meantime, housing providers are still subject to these data reporting requirements. So we're working to find out how housing providers can comply with the law as it currently stands. And we'll be working with the Department of Public Health as they work to implement the law to try to make the implementation as least burdensome as possible and as clear as possible for housing providers so that we all can know exactly what we need to do to comply with the data reporting requirements. And again, there's information on that on the CHAPA website. So with that, two more quick updates before I turn it over to my colleague. There was also a hearing on the economic development bill that the governor filed before COVID, the COVID pandemic broke out. And there was a hearing last week. The Committee on Economic Development is considering the legislation and will be working on it. CHAPA submitted testimony in support of the economic development bill, which included provisions, important affordable housing provisions, including the governor's housing choice legislation, as well as resources to build affordable housing around public transportation and climate resilient affordable housing. There are also provisions in the economic development bill that would help housing authorities leverage additional resources to help preserve and rehabilitate their public housing. And we're also, CHAPA has also proposed additional measures to make sure that affordable housing is part of our economic development recovery as we recover from COVID. And that's included the request to temporarily expand the state low-income housing tax credit for affordable housing so that we can both build more affordable housing and preserve it and make sure there's a strong pipeline of housing being built, as well as create jobs during the economic recovery. So I will encourage you to go to our website. You can download our testimony as well as information on how you can weigh in and support that legislation. There are questions, are those public housing dollars specifically targeted to state public housing? These would be for state public housing. Yes, this would apply to state public housing. And then if your proposals go through, how will we know that about COVID and specific housing programs? This is from Jerry. In regards to the data reporting law, we're working with the Department of Public Health and with the Executive Office of Elder Affairs to gain access to information that would be helpful to learn about cases in housing and to figure out how to share information in a constructive and productive way. So that's something that, again, we're working on with DHCD, the Department of Public Health, and Elder Affairs to be able to share information. On the last legislative update that I wanted to share, I just wanted to let people know that Representative Honan and Representative Connolly filed legislation yesterday called an Act to Guarantee Housing Stability During COVID-19 Emergency and Recovery. That's bill number HD 5166. And this is legislation that would extend, among other things, extend the eviction moratorium to 12 months following the end of the state of emergency, provide just cause protections to ensure tenants and foreclosed homeowners cannot be evicted for no fault or non-renewal of leases for 12 months following the end of the emergency, freeze rents at pre-COVID levels, and protect homeowners and stabilize landlords by expanding current mortgage deferment protections to landlords and establishing a COVID-19 Housing Stability and Recovery Fund to assist property owners who lost rental income or missed mortgage payments due to COVID-19. I haven't had a chance to read through the full legislation as it was just filed yesterday, but I did just wanted to share that that has been filed and we will be taking a look at that legislation. And I encourage you all to go to the Mass Legislature website. You can look at that bill, and I'll post a link for you to visit that bill number. And thank you, Andrew. It looks like it's also filed in the Senate. Again, I don't have much more information to share beyond that, but stay tuned for more updates on our website on the legislation. We expect that to go to the Housing Committee where the bill will be considered. So with that, I know we have just about 10 minutes left. I wanted to turn things over to my colleague Dana to provide updates on the regional meetings that the municipal engagement team has held, as well as a quick update on the report on local emergency rental assistance programs.
And what's the bill for? Is another 7.
Thank you, Eric. So I just wanted to give a quick update on, as Eric said, the regional meetings which we've been holding and the emergency rental assistance programs that we've been doing some research on. So on the regional meetings, we've had over 450 people attend our first 6 meetings. And thank you to all of our local and regional co-hosts, many of whom I see on this call today. We also have, I want to make sure that folks know that we have 2 coming up the week of July 13th for the Cape and Islands and Metro West. So please register for those on our website. All of the recordings of the sessions, the presentations, and the materials can be found on our website, and I can share a link to where you can find all of that information. Just a couple of key takeaways that we've been hearing in these regional meetings. The biggest concerns we're hearing are for people who were vulnerable prior to COVID-19, and what's going to happen if the moratorium and other assistance ends, and how folks are planning to get ahead of it. We keep hearing over and over that no door is the wrong door, and the #1 goal should be assisting tenants and small landlords to make sure that rent gets paid and people can stay housed. There's been a lot of discussions in these meetings about not wanting to return to the normal after this pandemic ends, and to use this moment to think about some of our long-term goals. Many communities are seeking regional efforts and collaboration in response, and we heard a lot about special attention to undocumented immigrants, the economic impacts on small businesses and tourism, and how that's going to create housing instability. That this is really highlighting how housing costs were really out of reach already. Disparities across municipal boundaries. In some of the regions, people were saying, in one community they've been hard hit by COVID-19 and housing instability, and in others they're feeling none of those pressures. So how do we come together? And also, just in this moment, as we're all sheltering in place, how can we ensure that the housing that we have is safe and meet the rehab needs of many of our communities? So I encourage you all to take a look at those sessions and attend one of the upcoming sessions if you are on the Cape and Islands or Metro West. And then very briefly, our emergency rental assistance program survey, we, in partnership with DHCD and MHP, had conducted a survey between May 8th and 26th to find out where local emergency rental assistance programs were both passed and being considered. In addition, these are in addition to state resources that are available, and I know we've talked about many of those on this call, but what we were really looking at was these local emergency programs. So just a couple of key pieces of data. The report will be available very soon, but some key things to think about as we were doing this data. So there were 48 communities that had approved programs and another 21 considering. That amounted to almost $21 million of pledged assistance from those communities. And the average rental assistance per community was around $325,000. If we exclude Boston, which is a big number, it's about $200,000 per community that's been allocated. The average assistance is around $3,700 per household. And many communities are using the funding sources that we anticipated they would. About half of the communities are using Community Preservation Act funds for these programs. Another 42% are using Affordable Housing Trust funds. And many of those trust funds may have actually come through CPA. So I just want to make that note that the CPA number might actually be higher. And others are using CDBG funds, and other, some communities are doing fundraising or have other local sources like linkage fees or inclusionary in lieu payments. Most communities are targeting people earning up to 80% of area median income in their programs, but some are going up to 100%, and some are targeting lower income brackets like 60, 50, or 30% of AMI. And many communities are creating priority categories, specifically those who have had a job loss due to COVID-19, and targeting people who do not have access to other housing assistance, either RAFT or a Section 8 voucher, or already in some sort of public housing or subsidized housing. Some communities are targeting families with children or households who have shown that they are at risk of eviction, although with the moratorium, that's changed some of the priorities. Just one last thing I want to say is there is guidance on the Housing Toolbox on how to create a program, so please check that out. But as we've been looking at these programs, we've really been focusing on how to make programs operate smoothly and the biggest thing is making sure that people can access the resources. So making sure that the applications are provided in multiple languages, that it's clear how you should connect with people, putting it on as many places in the community as possible, making those forms accessible both online and in paper form at post offices and grocery stores and food banks where people are going, and considering as many possible methods for people to submit the information, again with the idea that no door is the wrong door. So if someone reaches out to one organization, making sure that they get those resources. So like I said, we'll be releasing that report shortly, and I'm happy to take any questions, or feel free to reach out to me directly.
Thank you so much, Jen. I'm going to turn things right over to Abi. People can ask questions in the chat box that we can get to, but I want to make sure in our last 3 minutes, we're doing good, that Abi just has the opportunity to share some information on some new data and reports that has come out recently.
So I have a question. So landlord have the chance to evicting on the August 15, right? Is any change?
I'm sorry, I'm gonna have my colleague Abi talk, but I will type in a response to that that question in the chat box. So in the meantime, Abi, please share some information on some report and data that's come out.
Thank you, Eric. So just quickly, as we are all doing advocacy, it's really helpful to have these reports and data with us to just do our advocacy better. So I know many of you may have already seen this. The Boston Foundation put out their Greater Boston Housing Report Card. Usually it's an annual report, but this year they're doing like series of data webinars on that. And I'll be sharing the link soon. It just highlights how Massachusetts residents are sort of falling behind on housing payments as we go on from April to June, and also highlights the racial disparities where non-white residents are less confident that they'll make full June housing payments, and that we are facing a housing cliff this summer, and some policies to highlight how we can help that. We also have from the Boston Foundation a race and voucher discrimination report, which highlights how there are levels of discrimination based on race and whether a household is having a voucher as they seek housing, and also just a whole set of how that discrimination sort of is played out as they seek housing through realtors and through other housing providers. So just posting a link about that. As we talk about racial equity and racial disparities that are existing in the housing, these are some really great reports that are highlighting those with those specific data points, and it can certainly help our argument as we look into policies with the racial equity lens and making sure that we are advocating for anti-racist policies. And thirdly, there is evictions in Boston. It's a report by City Life, Vida Urbana, and MIT, which reveals that eviction filings before COVID were disproportionately impacting communities of color, and especially neighborhoods which have large share of Black renters. So I would encourage all of you to go and check out these reports. It has a ton of data, and just hopefully use the statistics to forward the policies that we have been fighting for a while before COVID, and especially during COVID. I'll keep that short, Eric.
Thank you so much, Abi. That was perfect. We are at 3 o'clock. I know we covered a lot, so I appreciate everybody staying with us for the hour. I did want to say that we will have our next COVID CHAPA call in 2 weeks on Thursday, July 16th from 2 to 3. So I hope that you will all be able to join us then. We will send around meeting reminders to everyone that's registered for one of these meetings. Again, also just to remind folks, we will post notes within the next few days on the CHAPA COVID website that you can download that will have information and links to all the information that has been shared. Lastly, just wanted to thank you again and to say I hope everyone has a safe, healthy, and happy 4th of July. And I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Thank you all very much.